Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And I wanted to share with you something that has been on my mind over the past few days, thanks in large part to our dear friend, Mr. Brian Sauer, of the great cinema-related podcast called Just the Discs. And he and I have been talking off camera, as it were. What a great guy he is. Such a really warm individual, such a gentleman, and so knowledgeable and enthusiastic as always. He knows so much. And one of the topics of conversation that he and I engaged in was regarding our own sort of cinema upbringing, as it were. That is, growing up and how we became, how we started to watch films, how we became more exposed to different types of movies, such that we became the film people that we are, I suppose. And one of those things that we did talk about, he and I, was the VHS or video rental store experience. And this really jogged a lot of my own memories and emotions about my own personal upbringing and childhood that I just wanted to share with you, some of that which is on my mind at present, which is about video rental stores back in the 80s. Now, I've mentioned this before, but I was born in 1979, and I was born in Japan. And when I was very young, my family moved to the United States, and then we moved to the United Kingdom for a little bit. But during the 1980s, therefore I was a child of the 80s, and I was growing up either in the United States or in the United Kingdom during that period. And so that's part of my upbringing. Now, during that time, I fell in love with cinema, going to the movie theaters and going with friends or going with my parents to whatever showing was available that particular time. And so that formed a really important, critical part of my own movie-loving life. And so that's very important, and it continues to be so. And I've generated a lot of wonderful, warm memories going to the movie theater during these times that I will try to cherish as long as I live. But that's not all, because as I say, during the 80s, I was a kid growing up. And one of the things that was so wonderful about this time in the 1980s was the existence of video rental stores, VHS stores for the most part, although there was one store that had a small Betamax section. But video rental stores were the place for me and for a lot of people my age or around my age to be able to watch more films and try to expand our horizons to the extent we were able to. Now, of course, don't get me wrong, during this time there were, of course, options to watch films, say, whatever was being broadcast on TV, network television, and that sort of thing. And then, of course, the movie theater experience that I mentioned earlier. But that meant also then that the video store experience was so important for me growing up that even now to this day, now it's 2020 of course, and there are no VHS rental stores around, unfortunately, because of course the marketplace, the environment has changed. Still, even to this day, many years after the fact, it's near 30-40 years perhaps, right, since those times. But even now, I have such fond and vivid and very strong memories of the video store experience during this time, the 1980s, and also into the 1990s. But during this time, these memories are still very strong for me. And what's more, I have memories of going to the video stores, the local video stores that were there when I was living in Connecticut, And then maybe a couple years later, when my family moved to the United Kingdom, we moved to a place called Guildford in a place called Surrey, England. And I still remember to this day in Guildford at the time, in the early to mid 80s, there was in the main town a large theater called the Odeon Theater. And then across the street, a little bit a ways across the street, on the other side of the street from the theater, was I forget the name of the video store, but it was a video store. And they had a rental store there. It wasn't very huge in terms of its area, but it had these large shelves that were very high, and it had the videos stacked, displayed in a way you could see the front covers for most of the display. Sometimes you had the spines that were exposed, and then the films were all divided up into genre. And then the way it worked is that you take the box from the shelf, which was empty, you take the box to the register, which was at the other end of the room from the entrance, and then they go and then they get the videotape, which was stored back there, and then the money would be exchanged, and then you'd rent the tape for whatever the period was. I forget what it was. Maybe for new titles it was maybe overnight or something like that, and then for older titles I think it was maybe a week or so, something like that. So that was the system, right? And I remember still in that video store in Guildford, for example, I was able to watch a lot of Agatha Christie film adaptations. For whatever reason, the box art for Ordeal by Innocence with Donald Sutherland comes to mind almost immediately, because that was always the one that I always saw when I was walking into the store. It was on the left-hand side of the store when you walked in. And another things too, when you walk in, you'd see the video title, you'd see the box art for like Prince of Darkness or Exorcist 2. You wouldn't have the Exorcist, the first Exorcist. It would only be Exorcist 2, because this was the time before Exorcist 3 had been made and released. And also in the United Kingdom, for the longest time, you couldn't see the film The Exorcist. And so I was in England at the time, where the only Exorcist film one could see, I think, was The Exorcist 2. And so I remember that box art as well. And I also remember, I don't know if you know this film. It was there were a lot of other like kids films that I was able to see through this video store, and then there were other video stores as well. There was one in Woking, Surrey as well, that I was able to frequent, and so that was also a very important part of my movie loving life, as it were. And then that wasn't all, because even in smaller sort of convenience stores like, I remember there was a small convenience store near where we lived in the United Kingdom, and it was, I think it was at a Circle, it wasn't K, it was a Circle C. I think that they have Circle C. It was something like that. I hope I got the title right, or the name of the store right. But I remember it was a small convenience store, but they had in the corner, they had a small little corner where you could rent videos from this place. And I remember this was such a great, and you'd see these really obscure, I remember seeing these obscure, at the time anyway, they were obscure Hong Kong martial arts films there. I remember also seeing a lot of horror films there, the Hellraiser films. I remember Hellraiser and Hellbound Hellraiser 2. This was in the mid to late 80s. Those had just come out, and then they were released on video, and so the posters would be on the walls. And I remember the poster art in particular for Hellbound Hellraiser 2 being on the wall in this convenience store, little video section of that store. And so that was really quite something. And so this was my time in the United Kingdom. And then in the United States, again, before Blockbuster, there was a small store near where we lived, and this was called the Roxy. It had the name called the Roxy, and you'd go in and you'd see all this. I remember seeing the poster for Eraserhead here, and and the film Morgan, the film Morgan was on this side for whatever reason I recall, and then over here closer to the register there was a wall of videos which was the science fiction and horror section, and that was the one I was most attracted to because I was really into, and I still am. I was into that horror genre in particular, and I remember the box art for a lot of films. They were really high up on the wall, and I was probably a little bit too little to be able to rent them on my own. But I still remember seeing the box art vividly for titles such as Extro. Remember Extro box art with the in that sort of whitish clamshell case. And then you had the video for the video box art for Zombie, the Lucio Fulci's Zombie. And the very famous tagline of "We are going to eat you," and the very famous still of one of those beach zombies, and many other titles like that. The Halloween films, and Visiting Hours, and the like. And so sometimes you'd have the clamshell cases, other times you'd have just the sort of cardboard slipcover type of casing, and so that was also very interesting. Incidentally, of course, right, for those of you who know, at least as far as my memory is concerned, if memory recalls, I remember that in the United Kingdom we didn't have those slipcover VHS boxes, right? You only had those cases, those open, the plastic cases that you'd snap shut. In the United States, you'd have the slipcover type of cardboard covers for a lot of the tapes, but never in the United Kingdom. So I thought that was an interesting thing. And so I remember when we moved back to the United States after living in England for a number of years, I remember being so fascinated by the way in which some of the titles you could get on VHS at the time were with these cardboard slipcover types of things. So, but that was very interesting. But going back to the video store experience, once again before Blockbuster, these video stores were the place for me to go. And I tried to watch as many videos as I could, but of course at the same time there was a limit to what I was able to rent or what my friends were able to watch. Sometimes we'd be able to rent out certain rated R titles or rated 18 titles, but other times it really depended on who was at the cash register at the time. Sometimes you'd have someone working there who was very strict about that sort of thing, and then other times you'd have people who wouldn't be so strict and be a little bit more agreeable to letting a bunch of kids rent some horror films or some sci-fi films, for instance. And so depending on the day or the shift, my friends and I would sometimes be lucky, and so we'd be able to rent out something on a Friday night or something, maybe a sleepover, and we'd rent out a scary movie or something, and that would be a lot of fun. And that formed the basis for pretty much my childhood in the 80s, watching films. Again, that's not the only component, because there were other ways in which I was able to watch movies on broadcast TV and in the movie theater. But the video store experience, it was probably one of the most important aspects of my movie-going life, or my movie-loving life. And when Blockbuster came a few years later, of course, that became still yet another way, another avenue for me to explore these films. And even through Blockbuster, I think there were a lot of films that one couldn't necessarily get at the smaller video stores. Like I remember, you could watch a lot of foreign films. There were a lot more foreign films that were made available, as I recall, through Blockbuster. At least certain types of titles, anyway. And so that was a great. I remember, in particular, a lot of Ingmar Bergman films, for example, being made available at the local Blockbuster more than they were at the local VHS store when I was living in Connecticut at the time. But maybe that depended on the store, who knows. But in any event, and I remember to this day, I was at my local Blockbuster in Norwalk, Connecticut, and I was into watching Bergman films because I just discovered Bergman. This is when I was maybe in high school still, and I remember the Blockbuster video that was near my house had the film The Passion of Anna, and it had the VHS box art. It said Passion of Anna, and so I took the box and I went to the front And I remember going to the front, and I remember the person who was at the register. I think he was probably maybe not so much older than I, so he was probably a young man, right? But he was looking at the box art, and he was really, I think he was sort of maybe making fun of me or something like that by, oh, this is the Passion of Anna. He was saying it in a loud voice, the Passion of Anna, the Passion of Anna. I think he was implying that the title made it seem like it was maybe an adult movie or something like that. Oh, here's someone trying to rent the Passion of Anna, so maybe he was trying to embarrass me. But in fact, it was the title for not a dirty movie, but it was for the Ingmar Bergman film, The Passion of Anna. And so for those of you who know Ingmar Bergman, and maybe those of you who have, for example, the Criterion box set, Ingmar Bergman Cinema, you'll know that film is included in there. And so, but I remember back in the day when I wanted to watch this Bergman film, I hadn't seen it before. It was the first time for me to see it. I remember, yes, that person working at the cash register in that Blockbuster Video in Norwalk, Connecticut, and really made it a point to say the title out loud in a loud voice, maybe as trying to call attention to the fact that he thought it was a dirty movie. But in fact, it was far from it in terms of its content anyway. And so, yeah, that was a very interesting experience. But my point bringing that up, of course, is that it was this Blockbuster store had this and other Bergman films, and so it was a really wonderful place for me to be able to explore these films. And but that wasn't the only place, because during this time there were many video stores, rental stores, here, there, and everywhere. And so depending on what store you went to, sometimes you could find different titles. And so that became part of the fun and the challenge too, which is trying to find the right store which had a particular title. I remember there was one occasion where I drove what must have been maybe nearly 2 hours out of my way to a store that I had never been, because I had heard that it had a video on VHS. I think it was a John Waters film, but it was something that was very difficult to find in my local vicinity area. And I remember that, and so that was quite an adventure, and it was a lot of fun to do that. And then later in my life, when I went into college, the video stores were still around, and I went to college in New Haven, and there was the video store culture was very much alive and well, and I was really much appreciative of that. And then later on, when I was living in New York City, many years back, there was a really great video store called Kim's Video. Maybe those of you who are living in and around the Village maybe know this, but it was a great place, because you'd walk in, and I remember the first floor, it's not there anymore, unfortunately, but the first floor would be the place where you'd go. I think the music was there, and so you'd have to go up the stairs. And then the second floor was, I think, where you could buy VHS and maybe DVDs. I don't know if Blu-rays were there, but Blu-rays are starting to emerge. In fact, I remember the Blu-ray wall was on the second floor in the corner, and it was very small at the time, so it was Blu-ray, but that was when it was just being released. That was when I was living in New York, going to Kim's Video. And then you'd go one floor further, I think it was the third floor. There would be the floor for the rental, the DVD rental store. And so that was a lot of fun too. And so even when the age turned to DVD rentals, that was still a great time. And I still remember Kim's Video very, very fondly. And the people who worked there were really nice. I was very fortunate to have been able to make friends with a number of people who worked there. And I remember that atmosphere quite vividly still. And even now, I recall, I remember buying some of my first Criterion titles, in fact, at the Kim's Video there. I remember buying some Eclipse sets, and I remember buying, I think it was, did I get RoboCop there, the Criterion? I must have gotten RoboCop there, or Hard Boiled, I think, but something like that. But I remember that, and I remember also the first time on the Blu-ray corner of Kim's where they were selling Blu-rays for the first time. They just started selling Blu-rays. I remember to this day Pierre LeFou and The Third Man being there, and so Criterion titles. And so I remember thinking, oh gosh, these are smaller. These are not as big in dimension as the DVD cases. I don't know if I'm used to this. I remember that. And so, but then of course the market changed, and so now here we are in 2020, and we know what home media is like. And so, my first exposure to Blu-ray was in fact in that Kim's Video in New York City. And of course there was the rental section, and so that was a wonderful place. One of the great places that I went to. I went to that place so often. I went there, and I went to I lived near Union Square, and so I was able at the same time to go to the Barnes & Noble in Union Square. There were many other Barnes & Nobles at the time as well. There was one near Kim's Video, in fact, but I remember going to the Barnes & Noble in Union Square a lot. And also the Strand bookstore, which is also in that area, and so I remember being able to go there rather frequently on maybe in evenings, and if I wanted to catch up with some reading or I wanted to browse the shelves or something like that. I remember that time. But Kim's Video was still there, and so that became, I think, the last major rental store that I frequented when I was in the United States. And so, and then I moved to Japan, and here in Japan, even now, there is a DVD rental store chain, and there are stores that are like that, although the number has been dwindling over the past few years. And so unfortunately, for instance, the store that I used to go to near where I live now closed its store. And so it's no longer there. It was there until maybe a few years ago. So, but there's still a rental store culture here in Japan, although, as I say, it is maybe steadily dwindling over the years or as time passes. But it's a nice kind of throwback or ability for me and for many people like me, I'm sure, to remember those days back in the day when we were kids growing up and watching films that we rented or that our parents rented for us or that our friends rented for us at those video stores many years ago on these VHS tapes that were usually not letterbox, at least in the 80s. They weren't. That came a little bit later. And so these were usually pan and scan, but I was young. I didn't quite know what that meant. I just knew what I had there was all I had, and that was all the world to me. And they'd had those warning messages at the beginning there, and you'd fast forward through some of them. And so you'd have the one in particular. If you remember that warning message about how this is copyrighted, and you had to watch it in your own home, and you couldn't copy it or something like that. And there was one in particular that if you fast forward, the color changed in the background. It went from yellow to orange to red to blue to green back to yellow again or something like that. And I remember if you fast forward through that, the color change would be so rapid. It would be like a swirling kind of rainbow, I remember. So that was one kind of warning message that I really enjoyed. There were many others. And of course, with VHS stores, one of the things was that you had to be sure to rewind the tapes, right? Because if you forgot to rewind the tapes, you could be subject to a small fine, I think. And so, depending on the store, of course. And so I remember there would be this extra added pressure to be sure that you rewinded the tape. And so you'd have to give yourself maybe an extra 5 or 10 minutes, because sometimes, depending on the machine, the rewinding process could take some time. And so there was that. Of course, we don't have to worry about rewinding tapes now, but back in the day, that was something that I always felt I needed to do, and I always feel so bad whenever I would forget to rewind the tape and just return it, because I know that feeling whenever I would rent something from a video store and then open the box, go home, open the box, and find that the tape wasn't rewound. And I would think, oh my goodness, now I have to put it in the thing and rewind it and wait another 10 minutes. I know that feeling, so I'd always feel bad if I, in turn, didn't rewind the tape that I rented out, because I know the person who'd rented next would have that same feeling of disappointment that I would have. So I'd always try to make sure that I rewound the tape, but I wasn't always successful, but I certainly did my very best. those are some of the things that we had to think about and worry about back in these VHS days. And so, on the one hand, of course, there's so much convenience with the time and the access with that DVD and Blu-ray and now streaming affords us. Of course, it's in many ways, in terms of visual quality, video quality, sound quality, and accessibility, and the types of titles that we can see. Now is in many ways a real renaissance time. It really is. We are living in a golden age, a renaissance age, and I hope it lasts as long as it can. But at the same time, I still recall with great fondness those times that I had as a little boy in the VHS store, just looking up on those shelves and seeing all these titles with this really weird, interesting, and very captivating box art, and so that really made an impact, and it made an impact to the point where I still remember it to this very day. So, as I'm sure a lot of other people in my same generation, or maybe around the same age as I, might also be able to attest to. So, but those are very important and fun times, the VHS rental store days. And so, while they aren't here anymore, of course, they still remain very potent and warm memories for me as being parts of my life where I really began to fall in love with movies even more. And so they therefore remain very important to me, and they will continue to do so. And I will hopefully be able to cherish those memories for as long as I live. If so, then that will make me very happy indeed. So, but anyway, I just wanted to share with you a little bit of that. And so I want to thank Brian Sauer for his discussion with me, and because he really jogged a lot of these memories for me. I just really want to thank him for that. And I also want to thank him for just sharing with me some of his own memories, because he has a lot, and many of which I know he shared on his great podcast called Just the Discs. So if you haven't checked that out, please do so. And for anyone else, if you want to share your own memories or your own experiences, please feel free to do so in the comment section below. I love to hear what it is you have to say. So anytime, my friends, anytime. Okay, so with that, let me leave you there. And so until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great movies. So until we meet again, my friends, thank you and cheers.